How's that? Can you guys hear me? All right. All right. Okay. Well, now we can actually kind of get started, being that you couldn't hear me. A little bit of news to take care of tonight. Some stuff to talk about, but this is going to be a lookout heavy stream, as you guys maybe saw whenever I was kind of in hiding there. I finished the lookout book finally, and I want to discuss it and really really talk all things lookout. We're gonna watch a few clips, and then we're even gonna watch a full length video about the career of Screeching Weasel that the Punk Historian put out. I get it. David the archivist. Maybe you guys can become friends, become fans of each other. Spread the love you guys have for each other. Um, Asked earlier when we were off mic about what we were listening to. What we were listening to is a band from my neck of the woods, from here in New Mexico, called Fighting Monsters. Pretty good band. I've met the guys a few times. Pretty cool guys. They had an LP or EP drop back in, I want to say August. Kind of a, if I describe their style, I would say mid 2000s, like Warped Tour, post punk. Pretty cool stuff. Check out my band with the greater good. We played with Teenage Bottle Rock a week or two before the pandemic, and then we were supposed to play with the Ataris on March. Oh, that's a bummer. That's a bummer. The Ataris, man, they've almost sold out their So Long Astoria reunion shows, which I thought was cool. I was wondering how much of a vibe they were gonna really throw out there. So I think that's pretty cool that they did that. Yeah, yeah, that is the vibe. All right, guys. And that playing right now is All Thick, another one of my favorite local bands. We're going to go ahead and put them on pause while we get started here. I'm going to share out this playlist pretty soon. I just need to come up with a better name on it other than my songs from my stream. And I'm going to just, bands all that I communicate with and get permission from, because I'm using their official music. So I don't want to play any music for anyone, obviously, that uh, doesn't want us to play their stuff. So if you are in a band, though, anyone that wouldn't mind your music being played in the awkward time when we're setting up the stream, go ahead and let me know. Send me some info. Find me on Instagram, RobsMV. Go ahead and find me there, and I will put your song on the rotation of our stream. Give some people a chance to go ahead and listen. All right, let's get into it. As I said, a couple of things on the agenda today. One being the Lookouts book and some Lookouts stuff, and then we will talk some news, have some fun. Feel free to use Richmond, the greater. I'll put that on it right now. I'm gonna add it to the playlist. Let me put that on real quick. There it is. Is that the right one? Am I putting on the right song? Well, it's a good song who's by someone who's going to sue me here in a minute. It says "For the Greater Good," single Richmond. Just send me a link or something, and I'll get it on there. Yeah. Oh, hold on. I never hit play. My bad.
Woke up from government Richmond, and I still feel like today. I wonder the streets 100 degrees were pouring down my shirt. How did I end up in this mess? Rescued out on the floor. Cried twice why I failed. Spent a couple of bills and downward spiral of hope. Well, someday this will all be over. At least that's what I told myself. And still make the dumbest decisions. Borderline masochist. You took me back to the good
That wasn't you guys. That was No Effects. Good song, man. I like that. That's cool stuff. Anything you guys do, just send it along, and I'll play it on the awkward intro time of this show. That was some cool stuff. I don't know what happened to my widgets, my chat box, and my super chat beggar button. They seem to have disappeared, but just gonna have to deal without them. All right. Let's get to it. So, a few things here. One is we have a few pieces of news. There's been kind of a lot going on, so I don't want to get into everything piece by piece. But what we did have was an announcement, some concert announcements, and there's been a ton. I forgot what this season was like because the last couple of years it feels like everything has been on such touch and go, and that's just the way things have been going with the pandemic and all. But what we did get is a piece of news I wanted to talk about is the Misfits, the original-ish Misfits. They're announcing some more shows. Now, we all know that this may very well just be a legal arrangement that the Misfits have to do in order to satisfy all parties involved. We know that they are a group of very litigious members. With that said, it's cool to have Jerry and Glenn on the stage. Even if they hate each other, it's still cool. But today they announced a triple pack of shows. This is from Loudwire here. Horror punk legends The Misfits have just announced 3 2023 shows featuring different special guests with each stop, with Megadeth and AFI being among those tabbed to open. The number of gigs now in the books equals the total amount of shows the band played across 2021 and 2022, meaning it's another rare chance for fans to catch one of the biggest acts of all time. Since coming back in 2016, the original Misfits, featuring original singer and songwriter Glenn Danzig and original bassist Jerry Only, as well as guitarist Wolfgang von Frankenstein, Doyle, that is, and Ace Slade, in addition to drummer Dave Lombardo. The group has only performed 16 times, and the first being Riot Fest in Denver, Colorado. So the new dates are set for June 24th with Megadeth and Fear as a support. Yes, Fear is still around. July 8th, you have the Gaslight Anthem and Fear in support. And July 15th, AFI and Fear as support. And it gives some details for more things down low. Those tickets do go on sale on March 22nd for any of those interested. And the three cities I should mention are Tampa, which is going to be Megadeth and Fear. Newark, I'm sure a bit of a home crowd, so to speak, for Glenn and everyone, and Jerry especially. And that's with the Gaslight Anthem and Fear. And the one closest to me personally, Phoenix, with AFI and Fear in support. I gotta say, I don't know how interested I've ever really been in seeing this version of the Misfits. I want to see it just for posterity. I know it's not very good. I've seen some of the tracks on the internet before they get taken down by the YouTube police. It's not like the worst, but everyone there does seem like they're having a great time. But you could not. It's pretty easy sell for me to get me in the building to watch the original Misfits, AFI, and Fear. Yeah, I don't think they regard their fan base one way or the other. Again, I think this is both the result of legal. It's kind of one of those things where you have to have a yard sale after you get a divorce. Have any of you guys ever seen did you guys see the Misfits with just Jerry on vocals? I've always heard that those were a really, really fun time, even if they were kind of just a weird show. But yeah, I want to try to make it out to the AFI and Fear one, just because it's not that far away from me, a couple hour drive. It's a significant drive. I got some stuff going on later that week though, so don't know if I'm going to be able to swing it, but we'll see. But that was the main news coming out of today, was the Misfits doing their thing once again. Now, we're here today to talk about Lookout Records. Most specifically, Kevin Prested's book that came out originally in the early part of last decade, but last year was updated. And of course, I am talking about Punk USA, the roots of Green Day and the rise and fall of Lookout Records. One second, guys. I don't have my notes. Be right back in literally 2 seconds. Well, that was almost embarrassing. So last week I got a comment on the stream, and I think a fair one. Better than Doyle on his own? Yeah, I would definitely guess so. I like the joke about Doyle teaching a guitar master class that lasts 20 minutes. I think that's great. Anyway, I would say so. Last week there was a little bit of criticism on the stream, and I don't disagree with it. It was a little bit of a slow moving stream, and I had some other stuff going on, and it just kind of turned into just a mess. And so this week I thought, you know what, I'm gonna remedy that. I'm not gonna be as disorganized and all over the place, and I tried not to be, even though we're like 20 minutes in, and I've literally said nothing. But I wanted to do my thing. I wanted to take meticulous notes and have them highlighted. And then I just left them in the other room, which wasn't the best choice. So as I pull to the page that I had for my notes on, as I am calling it, the Lookout book. Apparently, if you're a professional, you're supposed to have your shit together before you start recording. And me, I'm just, there it is. All my fancy notes, which are keying out with green where they're highlighted. I'm a true professional, people. All right. So I wanted to address some things with this Lookout book. First and foremost, do I recommend this book? Let's get that out of the way. Absolutely, I do. It took me a little while to start reading this. If you guys who follow on the community post probably have seen, it took me a minute. And it was a little hard to get into because I thought it might be just a little dense. So I was a little bit intimidated by it, but I told you guys that I wanted to do a review on it, and I didn't want to keep you guys strung out on it, and I thought it'd be something fun to follow, and I do think it will be worth our while. Now, this book, as I said, it's a little over a decade old, but there were some updates that were put in 2022, including a foreword by Jess Michaels and a bit of an afterword that updated us on where everything is standing at the moment. Here's some notes I have on the book. Now, when I put this out to gauge interest in reviewing it, a lot of people said that I needed to check out Turn It Around, the documentary that was put out, I believe, produced by Green Day about 5 or so years ago. I actually owned that on a streaming service that I had purchased it on, so I was well familiar with it. But that was also kind of, I would say, my mass familiarity with the Lookout story. And that's not the only place I'd ever dealt with the Lookout story, but it was the one deep dive I had into the subject was that documentary. And so I kind of have leaned on that documentary for the last couple of years for my general info on Lookout. I am of the age where Lookout has never been a force really in my life other than an idea. Lookout Records, by the time I started getting into punk, was clearly in its decline. And as you read about in the book, there was a lot going on internally. behind the scenes to make that happen. So it does not surprise me at all that I really wasn't a big contemporary Lookouts fan. There are some albums that I read about throughout the book that okay, I remember that, or I remember when that was going on. But Lookout Records itself just was not a force in my era. I always bring up like Fat and Epitaph and Asian Man and Kung Fu because those are the labels that I was getting the comps and the samplers from. That's where I was hearing the stuff from. I knew about Lookout, I knew the legend of Lookout, but I wasn't as familiar with it. So I thought this book could be a chance not only to brush up on my history and add to the growing body of knowledge on Lookout, but also to know the label from a very clinical standpoint. Now, again, in reference to the film, to turn it around, there are a few differences, and I think they need to be pointed out because every different piece of media seems to be told from a different perspective and have a different focus. Turn It Around, which is a great documentary in its own right, is a documentary primarily about Gilman Street and about the venue and then the scene that was created around it. So obviously Lookout is a huge part of that, but it's just a part of that. That film is about Larry Livermore, it's about Tim Yohannan, it's about Operation Ivy, and it's about Green Day primarily. There are other figures that you will encounter in that film. That's who the primary focus is. And those are the big names. Those are the heavy hitters. So I completely understand that. This book, Punk USA, is not that. This book is explicitly the story of Lookout Records. So the polarity is kind of reversed, meaning that the focus is Lookout Records and Gilman Street, Livermore, Op Ivy, and Green Day, they are figures of great consequence in this book, but they are not the be all end all in this book. This is the story of Lookout Records, and I would say the story of two individuals, that being Chris Applegreen, or Applegreen, I believe you pronounce his name, the man who would succeed Larry Livermore at Lookout, and unfortunately be the guy at the helm when Lookout ultimately went under. So he is a central figure. This is essentially his book. I know it wasn't written by him and he didn't authorize it. He was interviewed for it, but he is the structuring force of stability in this book. He is the main character. He is the protagonist in this book. If there's an antagonist in this book, and we will talk about this person a lot later, it's a little bit Larry Livermore, but I would say it's also Ben Weasel. When you really deep dive into this story, you think it's always going to be about like the Lookouts versus Green Day and how everything went down. And certainly financially that made a huge difference. But throughout this book, it is Lookout Records versus Screeching Weasel, more specifically Ben Weasel. They are at odds the entire time. So much so that I wanted to dive deeper into the topic. So on an upcoming issue of the Punk Rock Book Club, which I might start calling this, I am going to review this book, which goes into more detail about the feud with Screeching Weasel. This is How to Ruin a Record Label, the story of Lookout Records. This one done by Larry Livermore. So if you enjoy this, expect this to be a series. I want to make at least 2 other Lookout videos. I want to make the video reviewing this book because, just to be fair, that Larry Livermore is not interviewed in Punk USA. So I would say this is more his authoritative stance on what he knows. So I think that is definitely worth exploring. But also, I think it is worthwhile to make a video on the elements that killed Lookout Records, because Punk USA lays out, I think, the objective case of what actually brought down Lookout Records. But I think the joy in reading it is gaining inferences from all the little things along the way. Usually when any business goes away, it's rarely that one thing at the end. That one thing at the end might get cited like 10,000 times as an example of why it didn't work out or what is going on. But it's usually death by 1,000 cuts. This book, Punk USA, explains those cuts in like perfect detail. It tells us what's going on there. Let's change some imaging there so you have an idea of what we're looking at there. Punk USA, Lookout Records. So, and I just want to make clear too. And there's kind of an image of it. Don't buy it on Amazon, folks. Buy it on the website, which is linked down below in the description box right now. A direct link, actually, to make this purchase. But as you can see there, as I cover my face, that is a visual copy that's a little easier to hold up, even though I have now disappeared. There I am. Okay. So you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about right there, so I don't quit having to raise up the book every time. Okay. As mentioned, you're not going to learn about Operation Ivy, Green Day, necessarily a ton about Larry Livermore. What you will learn about, though, is the bands that didn't necessarily all become household bands out of that scene. And that's what makes this book interesting, but at times can also make it a little frustrating. You'll open up any random page, which I'm going to do now, and let's see what artist I land on. So, the Smugglers. There's a little section on the Smugglers right there. Pansy Division. Not an insignificant band, but obviously not as popular as the other bands mentioned. Screeching Weasel. There's a lot about them in this book. The Peaches. The Avengers. And even Tilt, who I like very much. So there's a lot to learn about those bands. Now, if you read the intro section by the author, Kevin Preston, he goes on to note that he was really ambitious. That is so cool, archivist, that you created their website back in '96. Now, Kevin, with this book, his initial vision sounded like he wanted to create a book that was like the extensive, full anthology of Lookout records. Now, there's probably some problems with that, in that it might be a little difficult to read and to research. You know, he's an independent book publisher. He's not going to have the massive cash coming in to get this done. With that said, I would say a feature of the book is not only the coverage of so many of those bands, but we have a nice little appendix on this book, which actually does catalog every single release that Lookout ever put out, and their lookup codes, no pun intended. So you can see here, what was the first thing Lookout ever put out? One Planet, One People EP. Second thing they ever put out, Corrupted Morals, and so on and so forth, all the way to the very end, which was the very last. This is my bag, the comp. So I really enjoy that. That's a feature you get. And I'll be honest with you, I'm glad he didn't decide to just chronicle every single thing ever about Lookout, because then the book goes from a book that's a fun read to a reference book, which definitely would have its place. I'm not here to hate on reference books, far from it. However, it's more readable in the form that it's in. The structure of the book, I should talk about that, because this is a product review. It has a very interesting structure, and I think it ultimately works, although it can be intimidating at times. So the book is divided up into several chapters. In fact, it goes all the way to 33 chapters. But if you're not a big reader, I wouldn't get too intimidated by that many chapters. Every chapter is just a couple of pages. The thing that helps to break it up is it pretty much has a structure of an introduction by the author, and then straight interview transcripts, not in the form of question and answer, but just little blurbs. So you might get a little section where it is, let's see, someone, for example, Kathy Bauer, who was someone else who worked at Lookouts. As you can see here, there's something from Chris Applegreen, then Kathy Bauer, and then the next little section will be the author, putting context to these quotes. So it isn't just transcriptions of interviews, but it's not long clumps of text where the author is deciphering what it is that everyone said and putting that into written form. This instead is the author giving context to the block quotes by each one of these individuals. So there's some parts, like I said, where some people maybe you're not so cool about hearing about, that you don't know, or so obscure that you kind of want to leave from. But that can be a problem at different points in the book. But what I do say as well is, even on a chapter that might be about something that you might consider a little more lo-fi, it is interspersed with the broader narrative throughout. Like there might be um, a chapter on a band that you don't care about, but then that's followed by a section on what was going on in mainstream music at the time and the business owners that they were doing. So they never lose that primary narrative. Although I will admit there were at times reading this book where I kind of just wanted to skip around the different interviews with the different band members and just go with Chris Applegreen and the narrative set forth by the author, because that really was the best part of the book. If I have to criticize this book for one thing uh, specifically, it would be on that concept towards the end of the book. I know that the bands and the albums that Lookout put out towards the end of their run are very, very important. However, it did kind of get in the way, because the end is very interesting. How this thing fell apart was super, super interesting. And that was the hook of this book. And I think that's also where the Turn It Around doc comes into play, because the Turn It Around doc provides the background information that you need. It puts faces and voices to some of the names that you're reading in this book. So I definitely recommend watching Turn It Around first. Watch Turn It Around first and then read this book, so you kind of know who the players are. You keep their faces in your head. And more importantly, because it was shot in like 2015, you have a better idea of what these people actually look like now too. And sometimes it throws you off, because you might have, a frozen image of them in your head, and that might not be completely accurate. So please go ahead and watch the doc first, then read the book, and it'll make much more sense. One thing that wasn't included as much in the doc was the fall of Lookout. In fact, we're going to watch a clip from the doc that covers about as much as they covered on the fall of Lookout. To me, the fall is always going to be a little more interesting, because that's like, what actually happened and what went down. And again, in the future, I am going to do a video of what I can feel from these three pieces of media, and maybe a couple others, maybe some issues of Maximum Rock and Roll, which I was pouring through all over the weekend as well. There's some funny stuff in there. So I want to go through all of that and synthesize that into maybe like 10 reasons that I think Lookout Records didn't succeed, especially in the wake of a label like Epitaph, which in the book it's compared to a lot. In other articles I've read, they're often compared to Epitaph. Like, well, how come Epitaph made it and Lookout didn't? And I think the book alone, along with the other media, you can draw your own conclusions. And I think they're pretty clear, but I do think that would be a decent video. Let me catch up on chat here real quick. Churchill. Man, I'm glad you, Archivist and Dave, I'm glad you guys could connect on this stuff. I hope that conversation keeps going. I'm in the process of, but it takes me like forever to do it, everything, putting together like a Discord server for the channel. That way we could just keep these chats going and share videos. And I think that'd be fun, because I think we have a small but cool little community here on our Tuesday evenings. And I like to keep the chat going. There's some other streams we can do on there as well. Adam, you need to check the book out. Recently finished Our Band Could Be Your Life. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, I'm in a mode of punk books. I go in and out of them. I have several of them. But I went on like this bind spree a few months ago, and I decided, I'm going to be reading a punk book every month. So as I said, I'm going to hit the Livermore book next. I read the Graffin book last month. I've got sitting on my shelf, Corporate Rock Still Sucks. I've got the Legs McNeil book. I have a really bad Ramones book from the 90s that is almost like satirical in how funny it is, that I would like to revisit. That one might be more of a joke. Maybe we'll do a drunk cast for that one, but I do want to keep doing the punk rock book clubs. One last thought on this book specifically, as far as people I found interesting. Again, Chris Applegreen, this was his book. I want to hear more from him. To me, he is super interesting. His story is super interesting. That's why I want to hear from most of all coming out of this. Didn't get Livermore. Only had Jess Michaels for the forward, which was just a very generic interview. none of the Rancid Op Ivy guys were interviewed for it, so it was limited there. But that did mean, though, you had a lot of some other characters, including the Mr. T Experience guys, the Pansy Division guys. All of that was super, super interesting to read, and how their ups and downs went. Also, the other note, I know I said one last note a minute ago, but let me bring in another one. The Donnas, man, the Donnas play such a huge role in this story. It seems like from every article you read, the Donnas are mentioned as part of the downfall of Lookout. They're definitely blamed quite a bit in this book. And I just think it's funny because when you think about it now, like how significant really are the Donnas? Like they're a band I only remember about when I encountered this older media that discusses the Donnas. Like I don't even think of them as a Lookout band, which they were. I kind of more interacted with them when they were more of the like approximation of 80s metal that they were doing. That's what I think of the Donnas. Which Graffin book? The most recent one. I have a video up on it on the channel too. It's not called Do What You Want. It's called Punk Paradox. I thought it was maybe the more readable of his books. It felt a little less academic than the other one, so I thought it was a little more readable. Definitely thought it was better than Do What You Want, which I had read not that long ago. I think they're kind of like companion pieces. I need the Bentley book though. I need an unfiltered Jay Bentley book. That's what I need in my life right now. So that is Punk USA. Like I said, get it. There should be a direct link down below. I am planning on reaching out to the author to see if maybe he wants to come on and do a Zoom chat or something like that. But I wanted to do this before I would talk to him. But definitely check them out. It's from the publishing company, the one that does the Glenn and Henry Rollins like fanfic. That's the publisher of it. So go ahead, definitely check it out. On that note, though, I wanted to watch some Lookout Records related media that's out there. Now, I'm gonna watch a little tiny section, and I do mean little because we do not want to get taken down for copyright, and especially if it's an independent creator, you really do want to respect them as a creator. So let me move myself around just a little bit. And let's check out how the doc handled the downfall of Lookout, which I thought was actually a lot shorter, and they kind of glossed over it because that really wasn't the story that the doc was telling. Here's a little snippet from the doc. Well, I had it queued
You might
up.
take a few lumps, but you feel better about your.
I had it queued up. Let me re-queue it up. My unprofessionalism once again shining through, strong as ever. Right in about this section here.
A huge effort to try to keep an equilibrium in the middle of all that insanity,
Well, I remember one of the big things for us was, okay, we're going to, keep the other two records where they're at. And like this stuff stays on Lookout. Lookout's doing a great job to put a record out with Green Day. It's got to be the next one. And, that's it. Not knowing that, we're going to sell more on a major label and Lookout's going to kind of go crazy. And
mid-90s, they were flush with cash. They had Green Day at the top of the charts, so they had the back catalogs. They were making millions of dollars. I don't know, $1 million, $2 million, I don't know, a lot of freaking money for a label that had been in a bedroom 5 years before. They had Operation Ivan money coming in. Rancid was getting huge. It was 1994, 1995. So they had that primary piece of back catalog.
On one hand, there's this one sector of people, everyone from Green Day and their management and their record label and all their new fans are like patting me on the back and saying, great work, look what you did. You must be so proud of yourself. On the other side, there's all these people like, you idiot, you asshole, you corrupt moron, you destroyed the scene. At the time that I left Lookout, I felt like I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I left in a hurry and I took the easiest route out, which was just to hand the label over to somebody who I trusted and hoped would continue running it the same.
And now they're gonna speak a little bit to Chris, who is the person, as I said, that this is mostly centered around.
Same way that I had.
Rather than necessarily follow suit and have Lookout become the label of bands that sound like Green Day or sound like East Bay pop punk, I chose to try to push the boundaries aesthetically and, to mix results. In some cases, I mean, a lot of people think that like sort of the post-Larry era, ruined the heritage of the label.
After a decade of bad management, it goes from benign to malignant neglect. It might not be on purpose, but you're not doing anything to fix it, or you're not letting people come in and fix it for you.
I think what I missed was seeking out the counsel from people that might have known more than I did, or might have even just had a different perspective.
What I remember about Tim is his enthusiasm.
And then the film goes on to talk about the legacy of Tim Yohannan, who obviously passed away in the late 90s. I said, maybe a criticism of the doc is that they didn't focus on it a lot. That does give a summation, though, I think, of what happened without giving any specifics. And that was, again, kind of my frustration at the time of watching it. It's not a frustration that it was a bad, because I thought the doc was very good. But I just wanted to know more. And I feel like now with this book and having checked it out, learned a whole lot more about the specifics and at least some of the stuff that you can infer from it. But they definitely, and I think the Livermore narrative paints Chris and that crew as just really frivolous. And I think that's probably unfortunate. So that's probably why, over the years, he's tried to get his name out there and set the record straight. Because it is kind of messed up the way he gets smeared so often. And I do think you develop a bit of an affection for him after reading the book. The other thing one of the other two things I wanted to check out, one of the other three things, is I wanted to just point you to something that still exists on the internet. This was back in 2005. You might recognize the name here, Rob Harvilla. He actually works for The Ringer right now. He is one of their music writers. So anytime you see like a music review on the ringer.com, which is mostly a sports blog, but they do deal in pop culture and music, it will likely be written by him. If there's an interview with Korn, it's by Rob Harvilla. Now, he wrote this article, for East Bay Express back in September of 2005. So right around the time Lookout was shutting down. The tone in Turn It Around, even by the people who felt very, very wronged by Lookout, was a little bit, years had passed, and I think there's a lot of people realizing that everyone involved were good people, despite some of the business not going as they would have liked. I think there's an acknowledgement, though, that these were good people. However, in this article I've discovered, because it's referenced in the book, it's just people throwing each other under the bus left and right. I would definitely go recommend that you read it. It's a little weird on the web, to be honest with you. The version I have right here on my iPad is like much more readable, because I actually did the reader version. But there's a lot of jabs, a lot of shots that are taken, and it really does frame this in the correct context, which I guess I can kind of spoil the end of the Lookout book, which is a little bit of the purchase of Panic Button from the Screeching Weasel side of things, and having Green Day and Op Ivy pull the back catalog. That just had, damage they could not, the combination of those two things, they really couldn't stomach. But this article, though, it is framed always completely as the album lost its lifeline in the Operation Ivy and Green Day catalogs being pulled. You get the impression from reading the book more so than the article that the issue that Op Ivy and Green Day had with Lookout was not so much that, were they behind on royalties? Yes, they were. Even though Green Day, according to this article right here, Green Day and Op Ivy were like the most sacred accounts, because that was the biggest sellers on the album. And as mentioned in that clip from the East Bay Punk documentary, the 90s were a time when those bands were huge, and normies, people were finding those bands and finding their back catalog, so those bands were still selling. And even throughout the 2000s, this article comes out 2005 in the wake of American Idiot being one of the biggest records in the world. Now, that's one thing I do kind of disagree with this article in the way it's framed, noting that they would have been in the market for a pretty big landslide of cash had they been able to keep those records in their catalog, because Green Day, 10 years after Dookie, had blown up again. And I get that logic, but it also doesn't have the benefit of hindsight to know that right around 2005, everyone stopped buying records altogether. So all the things that happened to Lookout seem to happen somewhat independently of the digital revolution. But that's also to say they probably also wouldn't have survived that digital revolution. Let me just glance really quickly at my notes down here from my annotated version I have on my iPad. There's a line or two I kind of want to pluck out of this article. Again, this is up eastbayexpress.com. Kerplunk is the title of the article. If you're waiting on the book, or you don't have the patience for the book, this is something to check out. And no, my annotations did not save. Okay. Well, one thing it did note was the money that obviously stopped coming in, but also the money that the label spent, which I thought this figure was super interesting. Those of you who put out records, I think, would have more of a context on this than I would. So there's a note about size and scale here. So Fat Mike was noting in this article, because he is quoted in this article, about how Fat Records super cheap. Like they had a very strict budget, despite bands like No Use for a Name and Lagwagon being fairly big at the time, Rise Against and all them. They had a very standard deal with them. They kind of didn't play favorites as to not overextend themselves financially or take any gambles. And Fat Mike notes that it's not only Lookout that did this. He actually noted how the Distillers record was a record that Brett Gurewitz spent a lot of money, a lot of Epitaph's money on. And so the profit is much lower. Now, it's a profit that you're gonna get with the hopes that the band blows up. The problem for Lookout is they never really had a band blow up like in them. And that's a funny sentence, but what I mean by that is they never really got the best of any of these bands as far as their sales time. You think of like, what's the best selling Screeching Weasel record? It's the one they did on Fat. Green Day's Dookie, we get it confused with Smash, but like Smash actually came out on Epitaph. Dookie came out on Reprise. Op Ivy didn't get like as popular as they got till long after their death, and Jess Michaels notes that in his forward there, where it's become more of this legacy thing. Yes, they were popular for an underground Lookout band at the time, and it does seem like Livermore's reasoning was always that he was not going to spend that much on anyone. Like Livermore was going to be, he was going to have the purse strings tight no matter what. The new regime kind of got caught up in the spend money to make money situation, and that's where they found themselves in trouble. And it's funny because when you read the book, the people that worked at Lookout kept saying like, we did not do anything to sabotage bands. We wanted our business to do good. However, the notion is that like they were only promoting the Donnas, and these guys are saying like, well, we weren't promoting anyone. So the bands have one of two gripes. It's either that they were only promoting the Donnas, or that there was no promotional budget. So or the third one is that they spent too much on promotion and it didn't pay off, which I think that's actually the right answer. Is they never had that second hit. They never had that next wave. You can look at like a label like Epitaph. They've got Smash and Let's Go and Punk and Drublick and all that, along with the Bad Religion back catalog in the 90s. Still, they were going through some upheaval in the mid 90s, and there's a mention of it about the struggles that Brett was going through. There's a note about that in the book, but they were still strong in the late 90s. They were riding the wave of the Warped Tour pop punk wave in the early 2000s, and then they transitioned not necessarily out of being a punk rock label, but to putting out other stuff, which is something that like Fat Mike notes in this article that he's never really tried to do. And I would say that the sound of Fat has changed, but it's still pretty distinct, and it's still very much punk rock. Even now he's doing his other labels, which it's not all following within the auspices of punk rock. And then now, Epitaph can put out a trap rapper, an indie band, and a Pennywise record, like seemingly all within a month, and we don't really blink. When Lookout tried to expand, that never seemed to work for them, and everyone else just seemed to resent them for not just having like a Gilman related label, just a complete. And it's funny because Gilman was kind of fluffy with them, and they go into detail of that in the book. They were the band that kind of broke Green Day, so they were kind of labeled as a major in some ways, even though that's kind of ridiculous. But they did wear that crown. And there's even a spot later on when they actually switched up with their longtime distributor, which was like this very very credible indie distro company, and went with a little bit bigger one. And there was like a debate around Gilman and Maximum Rock and Roll that if they were a major label or not. So it's politics and layers. And that's why this story to me, it just is continuously interesting. And I don't think it's a story. It's a story, obviously, I wouldn't say that no one is telling, because in my hand right here, I got 2 different books specifically on this story. There's a full documentary up there. There's another few videos we're going to watch in a second. So there's plenty on this story, but I could still feel that it's a undertold story in the history of rock and roll, or it's punk rock specifically. And I don't know that it needs to be a tragedy. That's one of my other points of this. I don't know that their story needs to be a tragedy. Yes, they are out of business, but that doesn't mean they were a failure, because nothing actually lasts forever. Some of the folks in the crowd who were fans of like something like pro wrestling, you have like an ECW that went out of business in the early 2000s. Doesn't mean they were a failure as a company. They just didn't last forever. And I think sometimes there's a distinction there that we don't remember. Before we watch the next 2 videos, though, I'll leave it open to the chat and see if you guys have any comments on Lookout, because I don't talk about Lookout enough. I'm more Lookout observant, I feel like, and I have more of a reverence, I think, to the Gilman scene, maybe because Gilman is still around, than I do specifically to Lookout. So I'd be curious to see what some of you guys have on that. And I need to rest my my voice for a second, or else I'm going to start sounding like a 13-year-old boy. Yeah, they do, Josh. Especially like when you study, I think, punk business, which, I mean, obviously Finn McKenty, that's kind of his area of expertise, as an expert in both business and someone who has knowledge about music. On the one hand, they are companies like any other company that just have those same internal politics and issues that any company is going to have. But also, there's always that added pressure of being something punk rock associated. I don't know why my chat is not showing up on the screen, so I'm gonna try something different. Real quick. Let's get that stream on here, or let's get that chat on here. I wish, though, too, with this Lookout stuff, we could just get a more honest assessment of their legacy, because it's hard, because you have sort of this push pull of the romanticism of it, and then the people that just that straight up had their issues. There we go. What are we doing there? YouTube Studio. That guy who was critical of my stream last week, he's totally vindicated after some of the production snafus that I'm having here. There we go. Let's go ahead and pop out that chat. Perfect. And I know this is fascinating stream we're doing here. Yeah, that's the truth for sure. There we go. Let me just throw it behind me now, and then I think I've got it. There we go. Almost like a real streamer. Let me just put the this little thingy more to the fore. No, you go. There we go. There we go. Now everything is a-okay now. Okay. Now we got the chat up there. All right. So some other stuff to go over. I actually wanted to take a look before we get into the Punk Historians video here. I wanted to take a look at how Behind the Music handled some Green Day related stuff. Now, in the future, I want to do maybe as like a membership perk, a full on like where we just hang out and watch different pieces of media, which we do on this show, but stuff in a little longer form, like a Behind the Music on Green Day, I think would be super fun just to see how that was treated. We're gonna go ahead and watch this short clip. It's a few minutes long on the internet about Green Day's departure from Lookout and how that was framed in, I want to say this was like the late 90s, very early 2000s, on how, you know, a very mainstream outlet like VH1 Behind the Music was framing the leaving of Lookout.
In 1992, Green Day pounded out their second album, Kerplunk. They ended up selling 70,000 copies, an astonishing amount for a band on a tiny independent label with no distribution system.
Kerplunk came out, we ended up doing a tour, and something happened. Our shows were getting pretty big. People were singing along to our songs, and we were like, whoa, you know, where the hell did this come from? So many people would come up to us afterwards going, man, where can I get your record? You know, it was just becoming more and more apparent that we were playing to more people than our records were getting to.
Green Day was outgrowing the punk community that had nurtured them, and they were about to face a critical decision. Stay small or merge into the mainstream and betray everything punks believed in.
We talked about it last week when we were having some fun with the AFI stuff. Isn't it funny that these conversations just don't matter anymore? Like they'll matter to us forever, even if they're not as important, obviously, as people within people would make them sound. Like I think we like to have these. I like to have these as more philosophical debates than like the maximum rock and roll Tim Buchanan style of like, you were at a major, so you're a terrible person. Like I'm not gonna quite go on that route.
By 1992, Green Day had established a huge following in the punk underground. They had sold 70,000 copies of their second album, Kerplunk, on word of mouth alone.
It had nothing to do with a major record company. It was our thing, and we did it off being self-sufficient, for God's sake. We did it on our own philosophies, you know, and we stuck to them. Something started happening that we didn't really expect at all.
What happened was Nirvana. In 1992, the Seattle band ignited a grunge explosion, thrusting punk rock onto the agenda of every major record label.
Nirvana was really aggressive, abrasive music, and the fact that that became commercially viable for a time, that really opened the doors to the possibility that punk bands could actually be signed and be commercially popular.
Suddenly, Green Day's unique blend of punk attitude and pop melody became a coveted commodity.
These A&R guys started coming around and, you know, here's my card. Ha, ha, ha. It was absurd, the whole thought of it. We just, this can't happen. There's no way.
Signing with a major label went against everything Green Day and their punk fans believed in.
Not only were we on an independent label, but we were adamantly against major labels at the time. It was all just watered down pop crap. I mean, I never watched MTV. I never listened to the radio.
Nonetheless, one record company after another courted the band and flew them down to LA for meetings. But the band just treated it like a big joke.
At least we're getting a free meal out of it, you know. And one guy even took us to Disneyland, you know. Poor bastard.
One guy, I forget his name, but he ended up drawing our Kerplunk logo on his ass, saying that he would do anything for us and tattooing on his ass.
Those stories are pretty legendary. Quite a bit of them in Smash, the great Ian Winwood book, and then Dan Ozzi's Sellout book. I love the one, obviously there's the famous one of Madonna sending nude photos to Rancid. I love the one isn't there the one, was it Rancid or Green Day that the guy, the A&R guy dyed his hair green before he met with them? Which I think that's some try hard stuff right there.
But there was one record label rep the band could at least tolerate.
Well, the music was very fresh. It was fun, and it was fast, and it had punk rock music influence, which was something that I grew up on and loved.
Rob was like the only person that we met that had anything to do with music.
Rob to us seemed like the person that was sort of least full of
Rob Cavallo of Reprise Records was a former musician with a genuine love of punk music.
All our reference points were the same. You know, all the things we cared about in guitar sounds and drum sounds, like it was like we were speaking the same language from day one.
So in February of 1993, when Cavallo and Reprise offered Green Day a record deal, the band was at least willing to listen.
One thing I was just sort of thinking about the whole time was like, what if? I don't ever want to say that. I was too curious, you know? I felt like we had potential. I don't know if it was potential for failure or potential to being the biggest band in the world. All I know is we had potential, and I started thinking about that.
They said, you know what, our music deserves to be heard by a broader audience. We think that we've taken it as far as we can.
For me, it was never about money. It was about, you know, let's see how far we could take this.
Green Day found themselves at a dangerous crossroads. They knew if they signed to a major label, they would be violating a basic tenet of the punk code they had grown up embracing. They would be rejected by their hardcore peers as sellouts.
We knew that it was going to get a lot of if it went down.
It was scary. We didn't know what would happen. We didn't know what the backlash would be, which was probably one of the reasons why we decided to do it, because we were like,
it was kind of like, you know what, if we're going to do this, you either do it all the way or don't do it at all. And so we did. We removed ourselves from the punk community at that point.
After 2 months of debate, Green Day finally signed to Warner Reprise Records in April of '93. Word quickly spread back to their old stomping grounds in Berkeley.
I was quite perturbed, kind of, you know, demanded to talk to everybody in the band and like, how could you want to do this?
There was not really much going back to Gilman. You know, it was, they'd already crossed the line, so to speak. You know, they'd walked away from home.
Despite the rumblings of discontent, Green Day headed into the studio with something they never had before: major label money.
All right, and that was just a little clip from Behind the Music from back in the day. Gives us some interesting insight of how I think that's a Green Day's framing of the situation. I will say this: I think the issue of you can't find my CD in a store is an issue. And excuse me, jeez, that was disgusting. Looking back at it, that tends to be the issue that bands have when they try to make that jump, or when they're tempted by the jump. It seems to be, or at least they frame it as less of, hey, we're gonna be rich, we're gonna be rock stars, of like we are selling too much to get that our music can't get to people. And I get that. I also think, and again, 94 is a much different time than even 98 or 99. But part of the strength of like Fat and Epitaph is that you could basically get them anywhere that wasn't like a big box department store. you could get their records. It was more than even just indie record shops. I can tell you just anecdotally, I could go to the mall over here. Obviously, Mall Punk, everyone's favorite, right? And you could get Rancid, you can get Anti-Flag, you could get No Effects. I think that matters. Like, that is something that, as far as a grievance goes, I think is super relevant always to this conversation. That is something that they just cannot be provided. Always. And in this case, it feels like, and this is a theme throughout the book and throughout the Lookout story, that they just could not make that happen. And I know they were very loyal to their distributor for a long time until they switched. And then they switched, they got backlash for it. That's the other thing of this whole Lookout story. No matter what they ever did, excuse me, no matter what they ever did, they got backlash, like just constantly. Like there was no right move for them to like ever make. All right, let me take a few more swigs of coffee, and then we'll get into Jack's video. That's what's a little longer. We'll settle in. I'll set that up. We'll do a lot of like pausing and that kind of stuff to kind of get into it. What do you guys think of early Green Day? What do you think of like the Kerplunk era? There's a note in here that I think is pretty interesting where it says, yes, the backlash was big, but it said the backlash to Green Day for signing, it was big, but it wasn't as internal as you might think. Like, people that were close to the band and actually close to that scene sort of understood the decision. Maybe they didn't agree with it, but they knew it was part of the game. It sounds like the hanger-ons were the people that were much less forgiving and tried to make this thing a lot bigger. And obviously, I think Maximum Rock and Roll. Love it, but nothing beats Dookie. My daughter actually got Dookie on vinyl from one of those big box stores a couple of weeks ago. She was playing it in her room, and I was like, yeah, it's a good song. The other notes from here that I think are relevant in a couple ways is the one thing about Green Day, at least I think you could say about them, is we talked about last week how in punk rock there's two different like pitfalls of signing to the major label according to the dreaded punk police. It's that you're part of the system just in general. So if you are theoretically a punk rocker who's here to take down the system, to have maybe some anti-capitalist sentiment or anarchist, whatever flavor you're hitting there, then basically working for this major corporation and having them distribute your music and your music become a commodity, and we know all that. And I think there's some validity to that for sure. And then there's also, I think, the one that we said applies more directly to heavy metal than even punk rock. There is the changing of the sound. Green Day didn't really do that. You might say Green Day's a little poppier on Dookie, but I don't think so. I think they're more polished. I think the production is better. I just think they were more mature as musicians, and I think that kind of thing happened. They didn't change their sound. If you watch the doc, it's not talked about as much in the book, but in the doc, like, they weren't even cool enough to play at Gilman. Like, they were considered power pop at the time. So I just think that was always their style. Now, I have also made the argument plenty of times in the past, and I stand by it, that like a band like a Simple Plan, I think, or a Good Charlotte were pop bands that enjoyed punk music and so approximated their pop music through punk rock, where I feel like Green Day is a dyed-in-the-wool punk rock band that had a poppy side, had a melodic tendency to it. And then it's also a chicken or the egg, right? Because like them or not, Green Day is just a ridiculously important band. One of these days I want to get into the topic because I talked about it before and I got some pushback on it, which made me think it would actually be an interesting topic to discuss. But I want to discuss comparing the early 90s, because I think the narrative gets washed a little bit too much into this thing of like people heard Teen Spirit, they put away the hairspray, and boom, it was all over from that point. I think that oversimplifies it way too much. Yes, Green Day, assuming Nirvana is like the biggest bang in that whole scenario, but look at, that's when the Guns N' Roses albums are coming out. Metallica is super mainstream. Megadeth, we talked about earlier, but also the punk stuff. Underground, obviously, that's when Suffer is is hitting, and the Bad Religion stuff is really cooking, and you have this stuff cooking. But 94, the year that punk broke, Dookie, that's also super big. I don't think you could have both narratives, that Nirvana just completely created the popular music scene, the rock music scene of the 90s, but also disappeared, and grunge died in 1994, and it was all dead after that. Like there's a little more to it. Now, like even Fat Mike will always say, like, no one ever thought about even making a living out of punk rock until you saw that Nirvana did it. Nirvana not really being a true dyed-in-the-wool punk band themselves, but the concept of punk. And I think Nirvana considered themselves punk and operated in a punk way. Which, again, going through those archives of Maximum Rock and Roll, which we got to do sometime in the stream, there's a lot of mixed emotions about Nirvana on there. From Josh. Oh, hey, Josh, I didn't know you were here. Check out Josh's channel, by the way. I noticed that last week. He's got a pretty cool channel. Let's send some love his way. If you want to put that channel link in the description, Josh, so we can all give you a sub and put that out, please do so, and into the chat. I mean, never got into Green Day, but I respect them for what they've done. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to. I think they're so important. Financially, they're the most successful punk band of all time, but they are the biggest, arguably. I mean, biggest punk band. Yeah, they are. Because I've even done in old videos, I've done the metrics of comparing them even to like the Blink-182s of the world and those bands, and they just dwarf them in terms of raw sales numbers. They broke in the 90s at the perfect time, and they're still a force, even though. And that last album was terrible. I just thought that last album was garbage, and I liked some of their later period stuff, but that last album, no, thank you. Also, Idiot versus Dookie should be a fun video. I think there's gonna be a lot of American Idiot retrospectives. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary. There's gonna be a lot of American Idiot retrospectives here pretty quick. All right, one more swig of the coffee, and then we'll watch Jack's video. Let me rearrange our scenery just a little bit for Jack's video. All right, here we are. So, for those of you who don't know, and we've watched his videos in the past on this channel, and he has given his blessing to do so because we do watch them in their entirety. The Punk Historian, really good channel, has several good videos on this channel. Around Halloween time, we watched his Misfits video, got a Fat Records video, a No Use for a Name video, Dead Kennedy's video, just tons of good stuff the guy's got. And I just like I like his style. I like the way he orders his videos. I'm jealous of what he does. I wish I could be as good as him. I think I'm finding my lane as more of like a podcast radio show host in this lane. So hopefully I can carve that out. But the Punk Historian is amazing. His Operation Ivy video, in fact, that's a really good one. One of the first ones where I had discovered him, and he's a big Suicidal Tendencies fan. So with all that said, as serendipitous as it is, he put out a 42-minute video on Screeching Weasel, which we are going to watch now, react to, and discuss on the stream. Because, as I mentioned, the Lookout story and this book in particular, go ahead and buy it down there in the section there, in the description, is really a lot of Screeching Weasel, Ben Weasel specifically, versus Lookout Records. So let's reposition ourselves here one more time. That's a little better. We'll put that up there, and we'll move me. Where am I? There I am. We'll move me down here. All right, let's check it out.
Remained a very large piece of the greater punk genre since it first found its footing in the mid-90s, and since then it's often played a huge role in pulling new fans into the genre. Pop punk has remained a very large piece of the greater punk genre since it first found its footing in the mid-90s, and since then it's often played a huge role in pulling new fans into the genre. However, pop punk hasn't always been the more entry-level and readily available version of punk. And in fact, there was actually a time in music history when the genre was so underground that being in a, quote, pop punk band would have downright confused people, including anyone in a pop punk band. But
I think that's the point that I think Lookout Records specifically really serves. I think later on Kung Fu and Asian Man to an extent really were good at presenting underground pop punk, which is a bit of an oxymoron. But I think you're referring to more pop punk as a style than popular punk. The way I like to use it when I talk about both the TRL core bands, you would say, and even like the Fat and Epitaph bands, they are popular punk in that way. But I think with Screeching Weasel and with these Lookout bands, it was actually a style, a musical genre.
obviously, things have changed now, and the genre has fully come to fruition. And if you ask me, I can think of a few key bands that helped get pop punk out of the deep underground and in front of a larger fan base back in the early days, defining the genre as not only a staple piece of the punk rock pie, but also as an entry point for generations to come. And one of those bands is constantly cited as a major influence by some of the biggest pop punk bands to ever exist. And despite being criminally underrated compared to these contemporaries, they still have a huge cult following and presence in the underground to this day.
How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and my friends, I am extremely excited to present to you this video that is long since overdue, the abridged history of one of my all-time favorite bands, Screeching Weasel. As I always do, I'll be taking you all through the history of Screeching Weasel from their humble beginnings in the basement shows of the Chicago suburbs, all the way up to their place in music today, along with discussing the impact they left on punk, pop punk, and on music in general, as well as some of my thoughts on them and their music.
Before we get started, I just want to let you all know that I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite Screeching Weasel songs, and if you're interested, you can find a link to that in the description below. I also have to shout out my wonderful Patreon viewers, D. Razzle, Martin Smith, Lovely Lizzie, The Real Ghost Freak, Project.
Not only give this guy a sub, but sub to him on Patreon too. I think he does like full album listen throughs, which definitely be worthwhile.
ZS and Robert Daniel Pickard. Thank you guys so much for your support. I've got a live album review and commentary series going on Patreon where I talk about classic punk records, so if that sounds interesting to you, I'll provide a link to my Patreon in the description below as well. I also have to give a huge shout out to Screeching Weasel's original guitarist John Pearson, or otherwise known as John Jughead. His YouTube videos helped me so much with the research for this video. Like I was saying, my video is a little more of an overview of Screeching Weasel's history, so if you're interested in getting even more details about them from a first-hand account, you should definitely go check out his content. And you can find a link to his channel in the description too.
And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways!
Like I said, the tale of Screeching Weasel begins in the Chicago, Illinois suburbs, in the town of Prospect Heights to be exact, which is roughly 40 minutes outside of the city. The year was 1986 and the band was called All Night Garage Sale. Originally formed by bassist and vocalist Ben Foster and guitarist John Pearson, the pair would recruit their friend Steve Dubik to play drums and spent some time rehearsing and building up a set before eventually deciding to bring in a bassist to give Ben a chance to focus on his vocals a little more. The trio would thus bring in their friend Vince Vogel to play bass, and this would solidify the original lineup of the band we'd all come to know and love years down the line. All Night Garage Sale took a great deal of influence from old school hardcore bands like the Circle Jerks, Black Flag, The Descendants, and especially Adrenaline OD, as well as some of their hometown heroes like Big Black and Naked Raygun. And this naturally resulted in them having a gruff, fast hardcore punk sound back in the early days. The band found that many of their favorite bands had a message and atmosphere at their shows a little too serious for their liking though, and aimed to produce a more lighthearted take on punk.
But isn't that the whole thesis of that original Lookout thing? Like, it's the kids who couldn't get into the 21 and over shows, which at the time punk rock very much was that. If you weren't going to like a basement show, you were going to a bar to watch it. And I think that the Gilman Street concept really is that generation that's just a hair younger. Like just by a little bit. They're in their teenage years. Well, the guys the rest of the crew is going to watch like a band like Fear at a nightclub.
This resulted in the silly lyrics on tracks like I Hate Old Folks, Twinkie Warfare, and I Hate Led Zeppelin on their early demos they'd pass around at shows. And a number of these early demos would later be re-released on a compilation album in 2018. There's not a whole lot of information on when exactly the specific tracks on this thing were recorded, but Ben Weasel made several posts with background information around the same time it came out, confirming that all of these recordings took place between the years of 1986 and 87. Speaking of the name Ben Weasel,
you guys don't have like a submarine show in Florida? Or, you can do a basement show, maybe mud on your feet.
Although the band would undergo a name change sometime in 1987 as well. After kicking around a few ideas, the guys came up with the name Screaming Otter, which was inspired by a shirt one of John's friends had that read, I've got a screaming otter in my pants. This name would be revised as Screeching Weasel shortly after, though, and I don't think I'm the only one who'd say that minor variation equated to a much better band name. Along with the band name change, the guys would all take on stage names too. Steve Dubik would become Steve Cheese, Vince Vogel would become Vinny Bovine, John Pearson, of course, would become Johnny Jughead, and like I said before, Ben Foster would from then on be known exclusively by the world of punk rock as Ben Weasel. The name changes were merely one of two major things in store for Screeching Weasel in 1987, however, as they would enter the studio at Solid Sound in Hoffman Estates, Illinois, and spent an entire day recording a massive 27-track LP that later made its official debut in September of 1987. The band had also been picked up by a local indie label.
Can you imagine recording a 27-track album? Just like with our attention spans today, just to get through one of those.
Called Underdog Records after owner Russ Forster saw them play in Chicago. So I guess you could say everything kind of came together all at once, and the album was able to get the band a little extra push with the help of Underdog. Much like their demos, the album mostly consisted of fast hardcore tracks, a lot like that of their influences in the Circle Jerks or Adrenaline OD. However, there are a handful of songs like Murder in the Brady House and Don't Touch My Car that kind of preview the more melody-driven sound they'd grow into in a few years. But keep in mind, this was still a super primitive version of what was to come. The band would then print up 1,000 copies to sell at their shows, and if you've never seen an original pressing of this LP, there were all kinds of really cool inserts that came with it. I gotta say, I kinda wish more bands still did stuff like this, but at the same time, I kinda understand why it's not really feasible anymore. Amidst recording release...
We talked about it last week, but the inserts, completely underrated and something sadly lost to time.
Releasing and promoting the debut LP, Weasel would also record an additional 4 tracks to use for a split with their friends in the Ozfish Experience. Having only gotten the green light to do one album with Underdog, though, the bands planned to self-release the split together on their own label they called Weaselfish Records. This split would never fully come to light, however, as the pressing plant burned down and the masters along with it. So the only copies floating around are actually its original test pressings, and if I'm not mistaken, only 3 of these exist. I'm not quite sure when
the book implies there's more of those. The press to the book implies there is more of them.
The recording sessions for the split actually took place, since it's a pretty obscure release, but I can confirm that it definitely happened sometime in 1987. Probably a little bit after the full length came out, if I had to guess.
So there we have the early origins of the band, but what was next on their agenda? And more importantly, when did they go from sounding like the Circle Jerks to sounding like a faster, snarkier version of the Ramones?
Weasel would start 1988 off on a not-so-great foot when things went sour with bassist Vinny Bovine and he was asked to leave the band. The bass duties would then be taken on by Warren Fisher from the previously mentioned Ozfish Experience, who appropriately took on the stage name Fish. The band would then resume their usual show schedule, and Jughead and Ben would simultaneously dedicate a lot of their downtime to focus on and reform their songwriting. Ben especially would put together a number of melody-driven structured tracks that drew a great deal of inspiration from the less aggro side of early punk, especially the Ramones. And although they'd continue to write fast, noisy hardcore songs, the poppier sound seemed to better complement their carefree, lighthearted take on punk. Not to mention, they got damn good at it remarkably fast.
Them being like a Ramones core band, and however you want to use that term, it really can apply to the whole Lookout scene, along with like Guttermouth and some other bands like that. I think it really helps boost my thesis about pop punk in some ways being the original form of punk and not a dilution of it, as others have argued. and what I always mean by that is I think like some of the original vision for punk rock was that Ramones style, and a lot of like the stuff that popped like the early 2000s, like the mainstream stuff, that was the manifestation of what they started. But these guys are the ones who I think took it literally, and just like what would the Ramones be if they were coming out of a hardcore scene, not necessarily how they were kind of spawning a hardcore scene in the 80s, the way that the Ramones were doing in their role specifically in New York hardcore, but more of that's the thesis I think of these bands. What would the Ramones be if they were a little less clean, a little more underground? That's always kind of what I thought these bands were, and I think that has some limitations, but only if you don't enjoy it just out of hand. Um, I do think that the other band though that always belongs in this conversation. Uh, yeah, sure, man. Send me drop me a line on Instagram or something if you want to if you want to do a little bit of a collab, which I'm bad at getting back to people, but please do so. Or find a way to chat with me on here. The other band that, like I always say, the other real godfather of pop punk is obviously the Descendants, right? That's the one that's kind of separate from these Ramones core bands. That's much more embedded in a much like dirtier style of punk rock. Yeah, and I think a lot of modern music or the like the 90s stuff was kind of based on those two. Like you mentioned Archivist about the Ataris, and I've just been doing a ton of Ataris deep diving lately. And if you see all these interviews with guys like Chris Rowe, they're talking so much about being a fan of the Lookout bands and the Descendants. Like they love Sam I Am and All. And I think you combine those two, you have late 90s pop punk like perfect. Like that along with the other pop culture influences that came, I think that's a perfect way to sort of define that genre.
To take another stab at self-releasing their music, Ben and Jughead would also team up with a local textbook salesman named Dave Best, and the trio would co-found the indie label Roadkill Records to put out Screeching Weasel's next full-length release. The group also intended to grow their roster and promote bands, and even though the label would eventually fall apart in the early 90s, it did issue a number of releases from other Midwest-based punk bands like Sloppy Seconds, No Empathy, The Effigies, and of course Sludgeworth, who I'm sure
I love Sloppy Seconds, by the way.
Some of you guys probably know started as a Screeching Weasel offshoot, but we'll get to that a little later. Anyways, before returning to the studio to produce Roadkill's first release, Screeching Weasel headed out on one of their first ever US tours, taking them all the way from Prospect Heights to the California East Bay, where they would play a couple shows with the region's hometown heroes Operation Ivy. These shows would also introduce the band to Lookout Records owner Larry Livermore, who liked them so much he offered to put out their album when he found out they were due for a new release. Unfortunately, this time around though, Larry and
Later, Archivist. Have a great night, man. Good talking to you again.
Weasel's schedules didn't quite line up, but just like with Sludgeworth, he'll be poking his head back into the story soon enough. After getting home from tour, the band would return to Solid Sound Studios in October of 1988, spending 4 days recording another 25 brand new tracks and a cover of the 60s hit song Runaway. The album then made its debut in December under the name Boogada 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 and was sold in a bright pink sleeve inspired by Adrenaline OD's also bright pink album The Wacky Hijinks of Adrenaline OD. This record would also feature Screeching Weasel's now iconic mascot on its cover, and I'm not exactly sure when the Weasel mascot came to be, but I'm willing to bet this was one of his first appearances. Boogada Boogada Boogada's first pressing.
Another one of those punk rock artifacts that is just so like bigger almost than the band, where like I'm sure there's people that have never listened to Screeching Weasel that can point that out of and know exactly what time and place that was probably popular in.
Would also include an insert featuring a photo of the band bowling completely naked, along with 2 audio samples featured at the beginning and middle of the LP. The first of which was taken from the TV series All the Family, and the second from the stage banter at one of their shows back in the day. Neither the audio clips nor the bowling inserts would be included in any other pressing of the record, which have thus made its original pressing very, very expensive in the resale market, typically selling for around $250 to $400.
After pressing a little over 2,000 2,000 copies of Boogada, Ben and Jughead were eager to get back out on the road and promote the new album. But after the last tour out to the West Coast, Steve Cheese and Warren Fish decided they'd had enough touring to last a lifetime, and would part ways with the band after the album's release. Screeching Weasel would then find a new rhythm section in drummer Brian Verman and bassist Dan Schaefer, who a lot of you guys probably know as Dan Vapid, but back then he actually went by the stage name Sewer Cap. Once the new lineup was up to speed, the guys would then head out onto another US tour, carrying all the records and their clothes in the same large plastic container on top of the car. And this resulted in many of the records they took with them melting and warping when they drove through the desert. They were able to salvage enough to still make a few bucks while they were out on the road though, and of course they still had plenty left back home in Illinois, but I wouldn't be surprised if this upped the album's resale value a little bit since such a large portion of the original pressing got lost this way.
Once they got off tour, the next order of business for Screeching Weasel was to get their new rhythm section on record. So they entered the studio once again in April of 1989, this time at Studio One in Chicago. This recording session wouldn't go as smoothly as their previous two, however, mostly because of Ben Weasel butting heads with the sound engineer the whole time. But he and the other members of the band have
Ben Weasel butting heads with people, I'm shocked.
also stated that they weren't really fond of the recordings from this session in general. That being said, I personally don't think there's anything wrong with this EP, and I actually kinda like it myself. And I'd say it just sounds like an early Screeching Weasel release, not all that far off from Boogada Boogada Boogada. The EP would be titled Punk House and made its debut in July of 1989 through Limited Potential Records, with a shockingly small supply of only 500 copies. However, due to popular demand, it was reissued through Selfless Records 2 years later in 1991. The Punk House EP would also include a really fast, snarky cover of the famous song I Think We're Alone Now, and although it isn't on streaming, if you're looking to hear this and the EP's other 5 tracks, I've compiled a YouTube playlist of obscure Screeching Weasel releases, which you can find a link to in the description below. Shout out to the channel Sweet Baby Jesus for uploading.
As I'm sure all of us diehard Screeching Weasel fans know, however, the Punk House 7-inch was merely something to bridge the gap between major releases. And along with the EP's first reissue, 1991 would also...
Which, being a Lookout band, they put out so many EPs. They just put out a ton, like too much to, I think, realistically track.
bring us the next big chapter for the band.
So as I mentioned earlier, the band had become friends with Larry Livermore through some of their tours out to the West Coast, and he'd even offered to put out Boogada 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 through his label Lookout Records before its release. But as you also might recall, Screeching Weasel were fully committed to their own label Roadkill Records at the time. But now things were a little bit of a different story. In fact, by the year 1991, Roadkill had more or less completely fallen apart, leaving Screeching Weasel in need of a new record label. Simultaneously, Lookout had been seeing some really solid success at the time, especially after the release of Operation Ivy's album Energy in 1989. So naturally, if there was any time to see if they could get onto Lookout, it was now. But much like they were for Roadkill Records, things weren't really going as smooth as they could be for Screeching Weasel either. Dan Sewercap and Brian Verman had started a band they called Sledgeworth that was starting to become a much bigger priority for them, eventually leading to the two of them walking away from Weasel altogether. But instead of instantly reforming the band like they'd done in the past though, Ben and Jughead also decided to part ways and explore other endeavors. The most notable of these is probably Ben's brief stint as the guitar player for the Vindictives, but Jughead would also take part in a short-lived band he called the Gore Girls with Russ Forster from Underdog Records. During his time away from Screeching Weasel, Ben would also direct and act in an independent movie called Disgustine that came out in 1990, and as I'm sure you can imagine, it is a grainy...
Does anyone have that? Why have we not had a movie night on that on the channel? We need that.
Mess of a film full
I'm gonna be doing some research on that right now.
Of stilted dialogue and subpar acting, but it very much has that terrible home movie charm to it as well. So if you're interested, I'll leave a link in the description below.
Never mind, it exists.
Thanks to the channel Chase Vegas for uploading.
Thanks, Jack.
Roughly a year after Weasel's breakup, though, Ben and Jughead would eventually start playing together again, but not as Screeching Weasel. After a one-off Weasel reunion show they did to raise money to pay back Dave Best, aka the funds behind Roadkill Records, Ben, Jughead, and the recently renamed Dan Vapid came up with the name Wiggle and intended decided to focus entirely on the poppier side of their last project with the new one. With Dan Vapid now acting as the band's lead guitarist, they brought in drummer Dan Sullivan and bassist Dave Lally, who took on the stage names Dan Panic and Dave Naked. And once everybody was all dialed in, the group quickly put together a demo tape. With their eyes still on Lookout Records, the newly formed Wiggle shipped off their demos to Larry Livermore, who came back to the band with a proposition. He thought the demos sounded like the makings of a new Screeching Weasel record, so he agreed to sign them if and only if they released the album as Screeching Weasel. So after agreeing to the deal, the band would spend 4 days recording at Art of Ears Studios in San Francisco during July of 1991. Like I mentioned earlier, this record would be the first time we'd see Screeching Weasel fully step away from their hardcore roots and focus solely on the pop-punk stuff. And I would say they made the right call here. This would also be the first album to put a great deal of the songwriting duties into the hands of Dan Vapid, and he would quickly become Ben's number 2 in the songwriting department. The album included 13 brand new tracks, along with a...
It's that dynamic, though, between Vapid and Weasel that ultimately, I think, leads to so much of the tension in this story.
Cover of Johnny Nash's 1972 hit I Can See Clearly Now, and it made its debut in September 1991 under the name My Brain Hurts. In my humble opinion, My Brain Hurts was not only Screeching Weasel's strongest release at this point in time, but also remains one of their best releases to date. And seeing how many of those tracks remain fan favorites in their set, I'm clearly not the only person with that opinion. The band would also record 3 additional tracks that didn't make it onto the record and were instead released on a 7-inch called Pervo Devo, which was given away with the final issue of Ben Weasel's zine Teen Punks in Heat.
The release of My Brain Hurts, extra promo from Lookout, and all the touring the band had been doing gave Screeching Weasel some solid push in the punk scene. And it wouldn't be long until they started drawing much bigger crowds at their shows around the country.
Although things were on an upward swing after the release of My Brain Hurts, touring and recording would temporarily be put on hold after the departure of bassist Dave Naked. The band would find a replacement in Scott Conway, or otherwise known as Gub, and he would accompany them on a couple of lengthy tours beginning in the northeastern US. Amidst their busy...
Big fan of Jack's editing style there, where he'll throw up something or put a anonymous picture if he can't really get a photo of a guy.
Touring schedule, Screeching Weasel would also issue a couple of 7-inch releases, the first of which was a 7-song live EP titled Happy, Horny, Gay, and Sassy, which was recorded at the WFMU radio building in East Orange, New Jersey, and released as a double 7-inch with a blank side on the second record. 5 of this EP's 8 tracks would then receive a re-release of sorts on another 7-inch with the same artwork called Snappy Answers for Stupid Questions that came out later on in 1992. And these would be the only 2 releases to feature Gub's bass playing, as he would depart from Screeching Weasel just before they entered the studio to record their next full-length album. To fill the role of bass, they would recruit Johnny Personality from the Vindictives, and with him on board, they headed into the studio in June of 1992. Recording sessions took place at Sonic Iguana Studios in Lafayette, Indiana, with the help of producer Mas Giorgini, and this would be the first of several releases he would collaborate with the band on over the year.
Yeah, Mas Giorgini really just becomes a central figure in the Screeching Weasel story, and quite a bit in the Lookout story as well.
Although Screeching Weasel intended to stay true to their Ramonesy pop-punk sound they'd pretty much become exclusively known for at this point, their newer material incorporated some external influences, most notably from the band Cheap Trick, who all the members of the band were big fans of at the time. Screeching Weasel...
as a power pop band, I don't think Cheap Trick is a bad band at all to take influence from.
Also brought back some of their hardcore influences they'd pretty much completely abandoned for their last full length, and the most obvious example of this is probably the up-tempo track Slow Motion. That being said, I wouldn't say either of these elements differ this album in terms of genre from its immediate predecessor, and function as more of a complement to the band's now signature breed of Ramonesy pop punk. Recording sessions would span between the months of June and August 1992, and although they'd intended to release the album that November, its official release would be delayed due to difficulties finalizing the mix. As a result, the record didn't come out until January of 1993 and was issued through Lookout Records under the title Wiggle. Having initially wanted to use Wiggle as the name for the reformed Screeching Weasel in the first place, Ben had still wanted to use it for some kind of future release or project, so it of course wound up being the title of the band's second full-length after reformation.
Screeching Weasel would drop a few additional releases alongside Wiggle, making time to pop back into the studio in between tours to pump out a song or two, developing a process, if you will, of getting really tight as a group out on the road, and then using that momentum to bust out new material in the studio.
The first of these would be a 7-inch by the name of Radio Blast that included 2 brand new songs. The band would return to Underdog Records for this release, and it would also be the debut of the now fan favorite track, The Girl Next Door. Weasel would also release a 4-track 7-inch titled You Broke My Fucking Heart a little later on in '93, along with 2 split EPs. The first of these splits was done with the hardcore band Born Against that Weasel had become good friends with throughout touring in the Northeast, and along with You Broke My Fucking Heart, this release was also issued through Lookout. The second split, on the other hand, would be done with the Florida-based Pink Lincolns, and was released through...
I wish the archivist was still on here. He could give us some insight onto the Pink Lincolns.
The Vindictives label VML Records. Along with these EPs, Screeching Weasel would also record a front-to-back cover album of the Ramones' debut from 19...
Which all these Ramones core bands have a Ramones cover album, like a full length.
76, which came about after they were contacted by Selfless Records to take part in a series of Ramones cover albums. As some of you diehards might know, a number of other 90s pop-punk staples like the Queers, the Mr. T Experience, and the Vindictives would also take part in this series.
I did not pre-watch, but okay, but I had that.
Putting their own spins on classic Ramones albums. None of these EPs I've talked about here or the Ramones cover album are available on streaming, so again, if you want to check any of these out, you can find...
This is great about Jack's videos, the way he just puts a link to every... Like, you can gain the full context, almost like a bibliography, perfect, that he does in these videos.
Find them all in the B-side playlist I mentioned earlier.
Although the band had already cranked out 7 releases in less than 2 years' time, they were still completely engulfed in a creative spree. And this is especially true of Ben Weasel, who largely composed the band an entire new record all by himself in only 4 months. That is with a little help from Dan Vapid, of course, who'd recently reclaimed his role as the band's bass player after the departure of Johnny Personality. In fact, the songwriting team of Ben Weasel and Dan Vapid had become quite proactive while they were on the road, reported to sneak off with guitars at times during tour stops to work on new material, and this helped the band tighten up their sound even more in the songwriting department. And all of this happening at once, of course, prompted another trip to the recording studio in the spring of 1993.
Weasel would return to Sonic Iguana Studios in May of 1993. They'd work with their new favorite producer, Mas Giorgini, again, and were so well rehearsed at this point, they managed to bang out an entire album in just 2 days. On top of that, the band members all showed up to the studio sick, leading to a really rough start for the recording session. But this wasn't about to deter the guys in their prime, and after getting some well-needed rest, they returned to the studio later that day and managed to get some damn good takes of the 16 brand new tracks. Screeching Weasel would also include 2 additional songs on the album called Totally and Every Night that had been recorded several months prior at a different studio called Flat Iron, and this is actually where they recorded their side of the split with Born Against. The record would then be shipped off to California for mixing and mastering, and it made its debut on October 8th, 1993 through Lookout Records under the name Anthem for a New Tomorrow.
Screeching Weasel would then hit the road with their friends in the Queers for an 8-week tour split up into 2 4-week runs, one on the eastern half of the US and one on...
All right, Adam. Catch you next week, man.
On the western half. And this was actually a big deal for the band as their internal dynamics had made it really difficult to stay on the road for longer than 4 weeks at a time. And Ben especially had been adamant about keeping their tours relatively short. But now with the break in between legs, they were hoping they'd found a promising solution to this.
Even with said break though, this still turned out to be too much time.
Hey Josh, is that about like Finnish punk, or is it just a documentary done in Finland?
On the road together, and by the end of it, Weasel decided they were going to call it quits again. But even as sick of each other as they were, the band still agreed to stick it out for some farewell shows and one more record. Despite the agreement, though, Dan Vapid would depart from Screeching Weasel sometime early in the spring of 1994, feeling that he wasn't contributing much to the band anymore. And it probably also didn't help that Ben Weasel had taken over most of the songwriting duties at this point. This would put some delay on the band's plans for a final album, but Ben Weasel had one more trick up his sleeve through some old friends he'd made in the underground touring circuit earlier on in the 90s. So Dan Panic used to rent an apartment in the Logan Square neighborhood of Chicago, just below where John Jughead used to live, in fact. Now, Dan had a few buddies that would always crash at his place when they rolled through town, and those guys all happened to play together in a band called Green Day. And
never heard of them. Never heard of them.
Green Day's bass player, Mike Dirnt, just so happened to be a huge fan of Screeching Weasel. And with those guys always hanging around Dan's place, Ben got to know him pretty well too. So when Weasel needed a new bass player, Ben called up his old friend Mike, who...
I need to do some research on that, Josh, to find that. That's definitely up our alley of people who love punk docs.
Agreed to join them for some recording sessions in Chicago. And once he gave the guys confirmation that he'd handle the bass duties for the album, Screeching Weasel hopped back into the studio in June of 1994. Well, not quite the studio. The band actually recorded the album in Dan Panic's basement, where he built his own home studio. And although this seemed to be a pretty unorthodox and unpredictable way to record, Screeching Weasel were still really interested in making a self-produced album. And with a little help from their old friend Mas Giorgini, things went much better than expected. In typical Screeching Weasel fashion, drums and guitars were finished in a mere 2 days, and a week after that, Mike Dirnt arrived in Chicago to record bass. The band spent a little bit of time rehearsing with him so he could get familiar with the new songs, but it of course didn't take him very long, and it only took them 2 more days to knock out the bass and vocals. Well, most of the bass parts at least, because unfortunately Mike would have to take off a little early since he was scheduled to perform on Letterman with Green Day. So Mas Giorgini ended up stepping in and he recorded the bass parts for the remaining 2 tracks. Neither of these 2 songs would actually make it onto the final release of the album though, but one of them by the name of Waiting for Susie would appear as the B-side for the single Suzanne is Getting Married that was issued after the release of the full length. As for the album in question though, Mas Giorgini would take care of mixing and mastering, and the album made its debut on September 13th, 1994 through Lookout Records under the name How to Make Enemies and Irritate People, marking not only Screeching Weasel's final release from their second run, but also their final official release with Lookout Records.
And this record would pretty much be the last we'd see of Screeching Weasel for a little over a year. The band
But the story has so many twists and turns, like, from this point.
would of course release that single I mentioned earlier, as well as a B-side comp called Kill the Musicians in 1995, but other than that, the band members would all focus on other endeavors. The most notable Weasel offshoot from this era is of course Ben, Vapid, and Panic's band, the Riverdales, which would drop 2 albums during their original.
And their arc, let's see if he gets into it, super influential in this book. The Riverdales are a super major character in this thing.
Run, starting with their self-title in 1995 that they followed up with Storm the Streets in 97. As I'm sure some of you guys know, Ben and Dan Vapid have sparsely kept the Riverdales alive as more of a side project over the years, but never quite as consistently as they did in the mid-90s, with their most recent release to date coming out over a decade ago. Jughead, on the other hand, would step away from music entirely during Screeching Weasel's second hiatus and shifted his focus onto performing arts. He joined an improv theater group called Sheila and took part in several performances they did around Chicago. However, this would prove to be a relatively short-lived hobby for him when he was contacted by his old friends in the Riverdales about bringing Weasel back.
Witnessing the success of Green Day had actually been a major inspiration on the guys to bring their old band back. Although these days there's a pretty sizable list of pop punk bands that maybe haven't seen Green Day numbers but have certainly stepped into the larger spotlight, in the mid-90s pop punk was still thought of as a pretty underground thing for the most part. So it's no surprise that a lot of other bands of the era saw this going on and got a kick of inspiration. Not to mention, with the Riverdales being hot on the heels of a European tour with Green Day, it's no shock they were curious.
I'll check it out, Josh. I'll be Googling it as we're watching here.
To see what they could do with Screeching Weasel. Upon their reunion, the band would write up some new material and began recording a new album at Uber Studio in Chicago, calling up Mas Giorgini to run the production side of things again, and he would take on a much more prominent role as producer this time. On the last few records, he'd pretty much worked side by side with Ben the whole time, but this time Mas was given a lot more control over the studio, and although adjusting to the new dynamic proved to be difficult at first, I don't think I'd be the only one to say that this resulted in some much crisper sounding production. Naturally, Screeching Weasel wanted to return to Lookout Records to put out their new release, but the label owners were finding Ben more and more difficult to get along with, so like I hinted at earlier, they wound up turning them away. Tensions between Vapid, Panic, and Ben were also pretty high at the time, as they were freshly off of their hectic tour in Europe as the Riverdales, and this certainly didn't help with negotiations either. Lo and behold, though, amidst the chaos of their band dynamic and difficult recording sessions, Screeching Weasel would still manage to score themselves a solid record deal with the newly famed Fat Records. While Ben had originally been trying to get the band onto Epitaph, this was unfortunately not able to happen due to a beef he'd previously started with Rancid when he wrote some antagonistic things about them in a zine article. And since Rancid were one of Epitaph's biggest bands at the time, they put a stop to Ben's inquiries with Brett Gurewitz pretty fast when they threatened to leave the roster if Brett signed Screeching Weasel.
What a counterfactual piece of history that would be, where somehow Epitaph does the calculation that, you know what, we're gonna let Rancid walk, and we're gonna pick up Screeching Weasel. Like, I wonder how different history would have been had things have played out in that fashion. Like, does Rancid go to a major? You know, because now they don't have that like super exclusive one of one deal they have with Epitaph. Does Screeching Weasel get bigger than they even did on Fat when they had a pretty good record on Fat? Like, it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Meanwhile, however, Fat Mike was looking to expand his roster for the then rapidly growing Fat Wreck, and since he'd worked with Screeching Weasel in the past when he lent some guest vocals to the track Peter Brady on Anthem for a New Tomorrow, I think it's pretty safe to assume that it only took a few phone calls to get everything squared away. And once the deal was signed and the record was all mastered, it officially made its debut on November 5th, 1996, under the name Bark Like a Dog.
After the album's release and a decent amount of revenue from Fat.
Love that album. I know people are more partial, I think, to the older Screeching Weasel stuff, but I love that album.
Wreck, Ben and Jughead co-founded another label they called Panic Button Records, feeling they could make it work a lot
Panic Button, the reason Lookout Records doesn't exist anymore.
better with the connections and resources they had to work with now. They were also able to convince Lookout to take them on as a subsidy, thus giving them access to some better distribution. This label would put out the remainder of Screeching Weasel's releases until their first long-term hiatus in 2001.
And for context here, Larry Livermore is not with the label anymore, and I think that's part of how they're able to sort of be in business with Screeching Weasel again, because Larry was playing complete hardball with them, I think, at this time. Like, he drew a direct line in the sand.
Along with releases from several other noteworthy bands like the Lillingtons, Common Rider, the Eyeliners, and Enemy U. As for the label's
The Eyeliners from my hometown.
first release, however, it would unfortunately be delayed due to the departures of both Dan Vapid and Dan Panic from Screeching Weasel. In the meantime, the band would release an EP called Formula 27, which included 4 outtake tracks from the Bark Like a Dog recording sessions while they looked for a new rhythm section.
Weasel would then find a replacement drummer in Dan Lumley, and the bass duties would be taken on by their friend and producer Mass Giorgini. Both of these guys actually made up the rhythm section of the band's Squirt Gun as well as Rat Tail Grenadier before that, both bands that Weasel had done a fair amount of gigging and touring with. Plus, since Mass had helped them in the studio with so many of their releases, I'm willing to bet it was a pretty smooth transition. The band would also take on an additional guitarist in Zach Damon from the band Zoinks, filling out their lineup to a 5-piece for the first time since Wiggle was recorded in 1992. Weasel would then record an EP titled Major Label Debut, and it made its debut on January 27th, 1998.
I like the idea of just calling your album Major Label Debut and it not being on a major.
Recording sessions for this EP took place during September of 1997, and Mass Giorgini has regarded this EP as the best recording he was able to produce with Screeching Weasel. Major Label Debut would also be the first release to come out on Panic Button Records, and the first release to feature the band's new lineup.
Screeching Weasel would continue work in the studio through January of 1998, though, returning to Sonic Iguana and spending a few weeks recording the instrumental tracks for another full-length LP. And although Ben was present for much of the recording in a producer role, Mass would actually record his vocals at his apartment using a mobile unit, leading the recording sessions to span out into February.
The new material Ben had written...
But this was the thing always with late era Screeching Weasel, is yes, they were a band, but like everyone was so isolated from each other. Ben, I think famously has the agoraphobia, where confined spaces and claustrophobia really, really gets to him. And this just became such a problem in this time period.
written for the album would showcase an up-tempo, punchier take on Screeching Weasel's sound, influenced by a lot of the hyper-fast skate punk stuff that occupied most of Fat Wreck's roster at the time. The band had also been toying around with the idea of bringing some of their earlier writing styles back, particularly that from Boogada, and were curious to see how some of these older ideas would turn out now with access to better studio equipment. The only exception to this was the song Pervert at Large, which had originally been recorded by the Vindictives for their 1997 split with Sloppy Seconds. However, Ben Weasel had actually written this song when he played for the band between the years of 1990 and 92, so it naturally found its way onto a Screeching Weasel album a year later. The band would also use an art piece by Mass's father Aldo Giorgini for the record's artwork. Aldo had always been a huge supporter of his son's and his son's friends' bands, and since he'd passed a couple of years prior, the band wanted to pay tribute to him by featuring his artwork on their album. Although the art piece might appear to be some sort of print design or computer-generated image, it was actually painted freehanded, and these types of really intricate patterns done with freehand is something Aldo Giorgini is actually really well known for. And finally, with everything in perfect place, the record then made its first appearance on August 25th, 1998 under the name Television City Dream. Although the band had begun pushing Panic Button with the major label debut EP, Television City Dream would still be issued through Fat Wreck, marking their final release with Fat until their reunion in 2009.
But Screeching Weasel still weren't done in the studio, and after some short time away, the band would begin work on a follow-up in January of 1999. Or for those who don't know, during the infamous blizzard of 1999 that took place in the central US and Canada. But a little snow wasn't about to scare a band from Chicago, and they would hole up in the studio at Acme.
Like, didn't that affect like the Super Bowl that year or something? I want to say, like, not the Super Bowl itself, but like the host city of the Super Bowl. Like, there was a lot of issues, I think, with that.
Studios and spent 9 days recording and mixing the album.
The band would work with producer Brendan Burke, and although Mass Giorgini would still take part in the recording as a musician, this would be the first Screeching Weasel full-length he wouldn't have any production credits on since My Brain Hurts. Ben would also take on a much more serious tone with his songwriting, and much of the lyrical content focused on his recent divorce, which inspired the tongue-in-cheek use of the term emo as the album's title. In other words, while Screeching Weasel certainly weren't a quote-unquote emo band, I guess you could say this album is as close as they got to becoming one.
But there was a time too where emo's kind of a pejorative now, but I feel like there was a time where you would just say the word emo as referring to punk music that wasn't like overtly political or subversive. Like, the way I always understood that, basically punk music about girls was emo. It's not a clean definition, but that was like in the air at the time.
The record included 11 brand new tracks, along with a cover of the Cranberries' song Linger, and as far as I know, this is the only semi-famous punk cover of a Cranberries song, and that's something I'd like to see happen a little more often.
Cranberries are awesome, Jack. I'm not gonna fight you. I'm not gonna fight you on that.
After mastering, emo would then make its debut through Panic Button Records on May 18th, 1999, and the band would then follow it up with the 7-inch Jesus Hates You, which included 3 covers of tracks from The Subhumans, Stiff Little Fingers, and The Stooges. After these releases debuted, Screeching Weasel would then embark on some short tours, and later issued a B-side compilation titled Thank You Very Little that made its debut on February 1st, 2000.
Screeching Weasel would then return to the studio in May of 2000 to record what would be their final LP of the 3-time reunion I think most people consider to be their original run. The album was recorded at Sonic Iguana, this time with the tried and true team of Ben Weasel and Mass Giorgini, and the band recorded 19 new tracks along with a cover of the Mangy's song I Will Always Do. The album then made its debut on September 12th, 2000 through Panic Button Records under the name Teen Punks and Heat, after Ben's zine from back in the early days. And this would be the last release.
And you got to remember, Panic Button at this point is kind of being subsidized by Lookout.
Screeching Weasel would issue through Panic Button Records. The band would split up roughly a year after the record's release as tensions from within and especially between Ben and Jughead grew higher and higher, eventually causing the two of them to cut ties with each other entirely. But their final falling out wouldn't take place until a few years later.
Yeah, I think when she passed away, that really, Josh, had people reflecting on the beauty of her music altogether.
Next release would be the compilation Weasel Mania from 2005, which also just so happens to be my personal introduction to the band. But aside from that and a few reunion shows in 2004, the band would remain dormant for most of the next 9 years after the release of Teen Punks and Hate.
As I'm sure most of us probably know, however, Ben Weasel and Dan Vapid would reform Screeching Weasel in 2000.
So before he moves on, I just want to note the lookout angle here, being that this is the theme of the stream tonight. So as they were kind of trying to smooth things over between Lookout and the Weasel side, because things had gotten so bad. And initially it seemed like it would be framed maybe as Weasel coming back to Lookout, but what it really was is they wanted to Panic Button to get completely bought out by Lookout. And I think even including the Screeching Weasel releases, that way Lookout would have those to have everything that was now being branded under the Panic Button umbrella. And Lookout decides to actually do this. They make this purchase, and this is something I think that they know as really kind of the death knell. Even though the official death knell is Op Ivy and Green Day pulling their catalog from Lookout, which again is also framed as something not just because of the fact that they wouldn't be able to pay him, but the fact that what if that catalog got sold, and then it's completely out of their control, and then now they're not just arguing with Larry Livermore over their catalog, they're arguing with a massive corporation. Now, the way it's framed in several different ways, several different places, that if they don't take on Panic Button, they can stay current with Green Day. At least Green Day doesn't have the fear that they're falling so far behind on payments that they're going to go under. So that move right there, the Panic Button move, is sort of the anchor that really got the catalyst, if you will, that got everything in motion on the decline of Lookout.
2009, with plans to release a full-length LP through Fat Wreck. The new lineup also included Drew Fredrickson, Justin Perkins, and Adam Cargan on rhythm guitar, bass, and drums respectively, but founding member John Jughead would not take part in the reunion this time, and he hasn't performed or recorded with the band since their brief reunion in 2004 after his final falling out with Ben Weasel in the mid-2000s. The new incarnation of Screeching Weasel would enter the studio nonetheless, however, recording an album at the Blasting Room in Colorado with producer Mike Kennedy between the months of November and December 2010. The record would then make its debut on March 15th, 2011 through Fat Records under the name First World Manifesto, and Screeching Weasel would embark on some reunion tours, organize several festival appearances, and plan to put together their own festival they dubbed Weasel Fest. All of these plans would come to an abrupt halt, however, when Ben Weasel infamously attacked a female audience member during Screeching Weasel's set.
Yeah, that was not good, and we have video of it, right? See if he puts in any of those clips.
At the 2011 South by Southwest Festival. I'm sure most of you guys who've made it this far into the video probably know what happened here, but just in case you don't, some drunk girl in the audience threw ice at Ben and it hit him, and then he proceeded to start punching her and also attacked another woman who was trying to break up the fight. This would of course result in Vapid and the others parting ways with him and the band being dropped from Fat Records, and I remember it being a huge controversy in the media when it went down, and I honestly thought it was going to be the end for Screeching Weasel.
But this leads me into another subject that probably seems like a bit of an elephant in the room to a lot of you guys, and that is, of course, Ben Weasel's history of causing trouble and acting up over the years. And while I've sparsely brought it up throughout the story, I wanted to condense it more into one section so I could offer my thoughts about it in a more concentrated manner.
So even if you're a casual fan of Screeching Weasel, I'm sure you at least have some vague understanding of Ben Weasel's history of acting out at times in really, really negative ways. And a lot of these instances have still been reasonably low-key, albeit still harmful to his and the band's public image, such as the many times he slammed other bands' music or made snide comments about other musicians. But there have, of course, also been times when things have escalated to physical altercations, but as far as I know, the South by Southwest incident is the ugliest his behavior has ever been. And what he did there was, of course, unacceptable, and not that I think he should be picking fights with anyone in the audience, period, but the fact that he went after a woman who is just being careless, I have to say, is a really bad look.
But Ben is just so tightly wound. And that's not an excuse for him either. I'm just saying, like, that's kind of how, it's kind of the fuel he runs on, it seems like, all the time.
And I know there's going to be some people in the comments that'll make the argument about how fans need to take responsibility for their own behavior at shows. And as much as I agree with that statement on its own, that's still not an excuse for 43-year-old Ben Weasel to go beat the shit out of some woman. If anything, the right thing to do would have been just to let the security handle it and throw her out of the venue. And as uncool as that might seem to some of you guys, let's be real here, he was not acting responsibly at all. And I don't think he or anyone in the band at the time would disagree with that.
But although we'll still see him getting into petty drama over the internet, I think this was probably a wake-up call for him to some degree. And even though he may not be the most stand-up dude around, it definitely seems like he's at least tried to clean up his act a little bit after this all went down. And no, I'm certainly not trying to excuse his behavior at South by Southwest that day by saying this at all. He should certainly still be held accountable for that. But it does at least show him making some effort to change, unlike a few other people we've seen come and go from punk over the years. Plus, I still have a huge amount of respect for John Jughead, Dan Vapid, and the rest of the guys. They all seem like really rad, talented dudes, and they certainly all poured just as much of themselves into the band as Ben did. So if anything, they've certainly earned Screeching Weasel a solid place in punk rock history, not to mention they've all put out tons of great music on their own as well.
After the drama died down,
I want to check out some of that solo stuff from the other non-band members. Not just the stuff they released in the 90s, but the more recent stuff, which I've never really dove into.
Ben Weasel would reform the band sometime in 2012, with the current lineup consisting of guitarist Mike Hunchback, bassist Zach Brandner, and drummer Pierre Marché. Zach Damon would also briefly return to the band upon their reformation, but he would part ways with them in 2016 and was replaced by Trevor Jackson. Screeching Weasel has then recorded 3 albums since their reformation, the first of which, Baby Fat Act 1, was intended to be the first half of a rock opera. However, this proved to be an unsuccessful direction for the band, and they returned to their tried and true formula for their 2 most recent releases to date, Some Freaks of Atavism in 2020 and The Awful Disclosures of Screeching Weasel in 2022, the second of which I personally found to be their strongest release since First World
Yeah, that's a good one. When that came out, that was a nice surprise.
Manifesto. But instead of dissecting the minor details of these more recent releases, I think it's a lot more important to now turn our attention to the legacy Screeching Weasel have left behind and their significant impact on both punk and pop punk.
So I would say the most obvious contribution Screeching Weasel made to music is their impact on the Ramones core subgenre, especially since a lot of these bands tend to sound a lot more like Weasel than they do like the actual Ramones. And while they certainly aren't the only band to leave a mark on this sound, it's pretty safe to say they're either one of or the most famous one besides the Ramones. Whether or not they're the best band in that genre, I'll leave for you to decide for yourself.
I mean, I think you could debate them and the Queers and the Mr. T Experience. I think all 3 of them you could have. That would be a fun debate maybe to get into on this channel. But I do think I view Screeching Weasel as the top of that food chain. I'm not necessarily saying they were better, but I do view them as the top of that food chain.
Yourself. But I would certainly say they made a lot more progress with it than any other band since the Ramones. Plus, pop punk bands of all varieties have been trying to recapture Mas Giorgini's production for years, and he's kind of another mastermind punk producer like Ryan Green who really set a standard for the genre in the studio. But obviously it doesn't just stop there, and if we're gonna talk about Weasel's impact, then we of course have to discuss how—
I was just gonna say, that's where I first heard about Screeching Weasel, was from being like a kid in middle school listening to Blink, and somehow that got into the back channel, the backlinks back in the day of someone shows you something and, hey, this is this band that this band is into and that they're shouting out. But I think it's the ultimate function of the mainstream pop punk is to get you into other pop punk.
How big of a mark they left on pop punk overall. Some of the genre's biggest, most defining bands of its prime years have cited Screeching Weasel as a major influence on them. And most notably here we have bands like Blink-182 and Fall Out Boy who have talked time and time again about how big of an inspiration Screeching Weasel were for them in the early days. But just like most cases in music, if the artists at the top are that heavily impacted by something, chances are it goes all the way down to its deepest underground. Quite honestly, I feel like Screeching Weasel could have been a lot bigger if not
for so many breakups and member changes over the years. Plus, the fact that they couldn't stay on the road for more than 4 weeks at a time didn't help them on that front either. But the music, the image, the attitude, everything else was 100% there. And this type of combination is really rare in music, and I also think it's a big part of the reason why Screeching Weasel has stayed a lot more relevant over the years than some of their early pop punk contemporaries that you don't hear people talk about as much anymore. The band left a huge mark on skate punk as well, not only being so well loved by that audience that they've been signed to Fat Wreck twice, but you'll also hear bands in that scene talk about them all the time. Honestly, I think it's pretty rare you'll find someone who's a fan of that stuff and isn't at least somewhat familiar with Screeching Weasel. They of course aren't an ultra-defining band in that genre the way one like NoFX or Propagandhi is, but I think their presence has definitely added some variety to skate punk and helped guide it into developing its more melodic side. And finally, I of course can't conclude this colossal video without offering some of my personal thoughts on Screeching Weasel. Although I don't talk about them as much as I do others, like I said at the beginning, Screeching Weasel is one of my all-time favorite bands. My first band was actually a Ramones core punk pop punk type of band, and we used to cover a couple of Weasel songs back in the day. On top of that, one of the bands I've been playing with and writing songs for these days has a similar feel to it as well. And I gotta say, jamming with those guys has had me revisiting Screeching Weasel a lot lately, and probably prompted this video. The first actual release I heard from them was the Weasel Mania comp, and I can't tell you how many times I've listened to that thing. When I was 14 years old, I spent an entire summer mowing lawns and listening to that comp over and over and over. In fact, I probably could have sung you any one of those songs from memory back then without even realizing I knew all the words, just because of how many times I'd heard them. And as I'm sure you can imagine, since then I've heard pretty much everything Screeching Weasel has to offer. Speaking of that summer, I'll also never forget the time my buddy Sun Ying and I watched the original Planet of the Apes on TV one late night, and I could not shut up about how Screeching Weasel had a song about it. And now while we're on the topic of good people, I know a couple of my really long-time viewers have been wanting me to do a Screeching Weasel video for a really long time now, but I wanted to wait until I could do it a little more justice, so if any of you guys made it this far into the video, here it is. I really hope you enjoyed it. But anyways, I think that about sums up our history lesson here on Screeching Weasel. I've had an absolute blast writing and researching for this one, and if you've stuck with me to the end, thank you so much for sticking around. But that's enough from me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What's your favorite Screeching Weasel record? How did you first get into them? Are you familiar with any of the offshoots they've had over the years? If so, which ones are your faves? Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.
Great video again by Jack. Let's give him the good old like. Give him a nice little comment there. I can't spell, which is a problem. I'm like cornered here weirdly, so that's why it's the most awkward moment ever. All right. Good video, and I think it really puts into perspective and helps like add to this body of knowledge that's been kind of the theme of the night of the Lookout Records bands and the role that they have played in punk history, specifically Screeching Weasel, because they're kind of the forgotten spoke in a lot of ways, even though they do have a heck of a legacy, as Jack mentioned in this video. Absolutely, but I still think they are not quite as appreciated, and I think it's the stuff with Weasel. Honestly, I think that's it. Not even the recent stuff, you know, where he assaulted the woman, all that. It's not just that stuff. I think, as they're saying, they couldn't really keep momentum even back in the day, and I think more than anything that hurts them. And I said earlier, like, how Lookout never had that second band, like that other act that was really in their prime when they had them. Screeching Weasel, I think, is the closest they had to that, them and the Mr. T experience, obviously, but I think Screeching Weasel probably had a little bit higher level. And like Screeching Weasel could never get their shit together in that time period. And if they had been more consistent, you wonder what would have ultimately happened to Lookout Records. Boys and girls, children of all ages, I think that's just about going to do it on this stream. This was fun. It's a little bit longer than normal. I didn't have to go and leave like I normally do a little earlier, so I was able to stream a little bit longer and had an absolute blast doing it. I like having a show like this, which outside of the opening was just a one theme show. Plan on streaming again, same time next week. I think what I originally had planned for today, but then I got into the book over the weekend and wanted to talk about that while it was still fresh in my mind, is I do want to do a recurring bit of segments, maybe like a series on a lot of the appearance of punk rockers and punk rock topics through 80s and 90s talk shows. Specifically, like there's an infamous episode, a few of them, of like the Donahue Show and that kind of thing. So I want to go ahead and check those out in the upcoming weeks, along with reacting to the news and any other piece of artifacts. Some of you, specifically Josh and 31 TV, I will be reaching out to shortly. So hopefully to get some more content. I think we got a lot of raw material, to be honest with you, out of this stream. So I think a lot of the stuff you've seen here will be edited into a YouTube video. I fallen a little behind on doing that last couple of streams, but they weren't my favorite streams. I liked this stream a whole lot more. But that is going to do it for me, guys. So I am out of here. Have a great week. I will talk to you next week. Keep in touch. Keep your eye on the community tab for any updates. Thanks for joining me. See ya.